mutual engagement to respect the independence and territorial integrity of the Chinese and Korean empires and to maintain the principle of equal opportunity for the commerce and industry of all nations in those countries. Reciprocal recognition of Japan's preponderating interests in Korea and Russia's special interests in railway enterprises in Manchuria, and of the right of Japan to take in Korea and of Russia to take in Manchuria such measures as may be necessary for the protection of their respective interests as above defined, subject, however, to the provisions of Article 1 of this agreement. Reciprocal undertaking on the part of Russia and Japan not to impede development of those industrial and commercial activities respectively of Japan in Korea and of Russia in Manchuria, which are not inconsistent with the stipulations of Article 1 of this agreement. Additional engagement on the part of Russia not to impede the eventual extension of the Korean Railway into southern Manchuria so as to connect with the East China and Shanghai-Quan-Nuchuang lines. Reciprocal engagement that in case it is found necessary to send troops by Japan to Korea, or by Russia to Manchuria, for the purpose either of protecting the interests mentioned in Article 2 of this agreement, or of suppressing insurrection or disorder calculated to create international complications. The troops sent are in no case to exceed the actual number required and are to be forthwith recalled as soon as their missions are accomplished. Recognition on the part of Russia of the exclusive right of Japan to give advice and assistance in the interest of reform and good government in Korea, including necessary military assistance. This agreement to supplant all previous arrangements between Japan and Russia respecting Korea. On 3 October 1903, the Russian minister to Japan, Roman Rosen, presented to the Japanese government the Russian counterproposal as the basis of negotiations. As follows: 36. Mutual engagement to respect the independence and territorial integrity of the Korean Empire. Recognition by Russia of Japan's preponderating interests in Korea and of the right of Japan to give advice and assistance to Korea tending to improve the civil administration of the empire without infringing the stipulations of Article 1. Engagement on the part of Russia not to impede the commercial and industrial undertakings of Japan in Korea, nor to oppose any measures taken for the purpose of protecting them so long as such measures do not infringe the stipulations of Article 1. Recognition of the right of Japan to send for the same purpose troops to Korea, with the knowledge of Russia, but their number not to exceed that actually required, and with the engagement on the part of Japan to recall such troops as soon as their mission is accomplished. Mutual engagement not to use any part of the territory of Korea for strategical purposes nor to undertake on the coasts of Korea any military works capable of menacing the freedom of navigation in the Straits of Korea. Mutual engagement to consider that part of the territory of Korea lying to the north of the 39th parallel as a neutral zone into which neither of the contracting parties shall introduce troops. Recognition by Japan of Manchuria and its littoral as in all respects outside her sphere of interest. This agreement to supplant all previous agreements between Russia and Japan respecting Korea. During the Russian-Japanese talks, the Japanese historian Hirono Yoshihiko noted, once negotiations commenced between Japan and Russia, Russia scaled back its demands and claims regarding Korea bit by bit, making a series of concessions that Japan regarded as serious compromises on Russia's part. 37. The war might not have broken out had not the issues of Korea and Manchuria become linked. 38. The Korean and Manchurian issues had become linked as the Prime Minister of Japan, Katsura Taro, in office 1901 to 1906, decided if war did come, that Japan was more likely to have the support of the United States and Great Britain if the war could be presented as a struggle for free trade against the highly protectionist Russian Empire. In which case, Manchuria, which was the larger market than Korea, was more likely to engage Anglo-American sympathies. 38. Throughout the war, Japanese propaganda presented the recurring theme of Japan as a civilized power that supported free trade and would implicitly allow foreign businesses into the resource-rich region of Manchuria, versus Russia, the uncivilized power that was protectionist and wanted to keep the riches of Manchuria all to itself. Emperor Gojong of Korea, king from 1864 to 1897, emperor from 1897 to 1907, came to believe that the issue dividing Japan and Russia was Manchuria, and chose to pursue a policy of neutrality as the best way of preserving Korean independence as the crisis mounted. 37. In a series of reports to Beijing, Hu Weidi, the Chinese ambassador in St. Petersburg from July 1902 to September 1907, looked closely at whether a Russian or a Japanese victory would be favorable to China, and argued that the latter was preferable, as he maintained a Japanese victory presented the better chance for China to regain sovereignty over Manchuria. 37. In December 1903, China decided to remain neutral if war came, because though Japan was the only power capable of evicting Russia from Manchuria, the extent of Japanese ambitions in Manchuria was not clear to Beijing. 37. Russian-Japanese negotiations then followed. Although by early January 1904 the Japanese government had realized that Russia was not interested in settling the Manchurian or Korean issues. Instead, Russia's goal was buying time, via diplomacy, to further build up militarily. 39. In December 1903, Wilhelm wrote in a marginal note on a diplomatic dispatch about his role in inflaming Russo-Japanese relations. Since 97, Kiaochao, we have never left Russia in any doubt that we would cover her back in Europe, in case she decided to pursue a bigger policy in the Far East that might lead to military complications, with the aim of relieving our eastern border from the fearful pressure and threat of the massive Russian army. Whereupon, Russia took Port Arthur and trusting us, took her fleet out of the Baltic, thereby making herself vulnerable to us by sea. In Danzig 01 and Reval 02, the same assurance was given again, with result that entire Russian divisions from Poland and European Russia were and are being sent to the Far East. This would not have happened if our governments had not been in agreement. A recurring theme of Wilhelm's letters to Nicholas was that Holy Russia had been chosen by God to save the entire race from the peril, and that Russia was entitled to annex all of Korea, Manchuria, and northern China up to Beijing. 41. Wilhelm went on to assure Nicholas that once Russia had defeated Japan, this would be a deadly blow to British diplomacy, and that the two emperors, the self-proclaimed Admiral of the Atlantic, and the Admiral of the Pacific, would rule Eurasia together, making them able to challenge British sea power as the resources of Eurasia would make their empires immune to a British blockade, and thus allowing Germany and Russia to divide up the best of the British colonies in Asia between them. 41. Nicholas had been prepared to compromise with Japan, but after receiving a letter from Wilhelm attacking him as a coward for his willingness to compromise with the Japanese, who, Wilhelm never ceasing reminding Nicholas, represented the peril for the sake of peace, became more obstinate. 42. Wilhelm had written to Nicholas stating that the question of Russian interests in Manchuria and Korea was beside the point, saying instead it was a matter of Russia undertaking the protection and defense of the race, and with it, Christian civilization, against the race, and whatever the heir determined to ensure the domination of the race in East Asia, to put themselves at its head and organize and lead it into battle against the race. That is the kernel of the situation, and therefore there can be very little doubt about where the sympathies of all halfway intelligent Europeans should lie. England betrayed Europe's interests to America in a cowardly and shameful way over the Panama Canal question, so as to be left in peace by the Yankees. Will the Tsar likewise betray the interests of the race to the yellow as to be left in peace, and not embarrass the Hague Tribunal too much? 42. When Nicholas replied that he still wanted peace, Wilhelm wrote back in a telegram, "You innocent angel," telling his advisors, "This is the language of an innocent angel, but not that of a Tsar." 42. Nevertheless, Tokyo believed that Russia was not serious about seeking a peaceful solution to the dispute. On 13 January 1904, Japan proposed a formula by which Manchuria would remain outside Japan's sphere of influence and, reciprocally, Korea outside Russia's. On 21 December 1903, the Taro cabinet voted to go to war against Russia. By 4 February 1904, no formal reply had been received from St. Petersburg. On 6 February the Japanese minister to Russia, Kurino Shinichiro, was recalled, and Japan severed diplomatic relations with Russia. 39. Potential diplomatic resolution of territorial concerns between Japan and Russia failed. Historians have argued that this directly resulted from the actions of Emperor Nicholas II. Crucially, Nicholas mismanaged his government. Although certain scholars contend that the situation arose from the determination of Nicholas II to use the war against Japan to spark a revival in Russian patriotism, no historical evidence supports this claim. 43. The Tsar's advisors did not support the war. Foreseeing problems in transporting troops and supplies from European Russia to the east. 44. The Tsar himself repeatedly delayed negotiations with the Japanese government as he believed that he was protected by God and the autocracy. 45. The Japanese understanding of this can be seen in a telegram from Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs Komura to the Minister to Russia, in which he stated, "The Japanese government have at all times during the progress of the negotiations made it a special point to give prompt answers to all propositions of the Russian government. The negotiations have now been pending for no less than 4 months, and they have not yet reached a stage where the final issue can with certainty be predicted. In these circumstances the Japanese government cannot but regard with grave concern the situation for which the delays in negotiations are largely responsible." 46. Some scholars have suggested that Nicholas II dragged Japan into war intentionally, in hopes of reviving Russian nationalism. This notion conflicts with a comment made by Nicholas to Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, saying there would be no war because he did not wish it. 47. This does not reject the claim that Russia played an aggressive role in the East, which it did. Rather, it means that Russia unwisely calculated and supposed that Japan would not go to war against Russia's far larger and seemingly superior navy and army. Nicholas held the Japanese in contempt and he took for granted that the Japanese would simply yield in the face of Russia's superior power, which thus explains his unwillingness to compromise. 48. Evidence of Russia's false sense of security and superiority to Japan is seen by Russian reference to Japan's choosing war as a big mistake. Japan issued a declaration of war on 8 February 1904, 59. However, 3 hours before Japan's declaration of war was received by the Russian government, and without warning, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the Russian Far East Fleet at Port Arthur. 60. Tsar Nicholas II was stunned by news of the attack. He could not believe that Japan would commit an act of war without a formal declaration, and had been assured by his ministers that the Japanese would not fight when the attack came. According to Cecil Spring Rice, first secretary at the British Embassy, it left the Tsar almost incredulous. 61. Russia declared war on Japan 8 days later. 62. Japan, in response, made reference to the Russian attack on Sweden in 1808 without declaration of war. Although the requirement to mediate disputes between states before commencing hostilities was made international law in 1899, and again in 1907. With the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, 63, 64, 65. The Qing Empire favored the Japanese position and even offered military aid, but Japan declined it. However, Yuan Shikai sent envoys to Japanese generals several times to deliver foodstuffs and alcoholic drinks. Native Manchurians joined the war on both sides as hired troops. Military leaders and senior Tsarist officials agreed before the war that Russia was a much stronger nation and had little to fear from the Empire of Japan. The fanatical zeal of the Japanese infantrymen astonished the Russians, who were dismayed by the apathy, backwardness, and defeatism of their own soldiers. 89. The defeats of the army and navy shook Russian confidence. Throughout 1905, the Imperial Russian government was rocked by revolution. The population was against escalation of the war. The empire was certainly capable of sending more troops, but this would make little difference in the outcome due to the poor state of the economy. The embarrassing defeats of the Russian army and navy by the Japanese, and the relative unimportance to Russia of the disputed land made the war extremely unpopular. 90. Tsar Nicholas II elected to negotiate peace so he could concentrate on internal matters after the disaster of Bloody Sunday on 9 January 1905. Both sides accepted the offer of United States President Theodore Roosevelt to mediate. Meetings were held in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, with Sergei Witte leading the Russian delegation and Baron Komura leading the Japanese delegation. The Treaty of Portsmouth was signed on 5 September 1905 at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. 91. 92. Witte became Russian Prime Minister the same year. After courting the Japanese, Roosevelt decided to support the Tsar's refusal to pay indemnities, a move that policymakers in Tokyo interpreted as signifying that the United States had more than a passing interest in Asian affairs. Russia recognized Korea as part of the Japanese sphere of influence, 93, and agreed to evacuate Manchuria. Japan would annex Korea in 1910, Japan-Korea Treaty of 1910. With scant protest from other powers. 94. From 1910 until the end of its occupation of Korea in 1945. The Japanese adopted a strategy of using the Korean peninsula as a gateway to the Asian continent and making Korea's economy subordinate to Japanese economic interests. 93. Russia also signed over its 25-year leasehold rights to Port Arthur, including the naval base and the peninsula around it, and ceded the southern half of Sakhalin Island to Japan. Sakhalin would be taken back by the Soviet Union following the defeat of the Japanese in World War II. Roosevelt earned the Nobel Peace Prize for his effort. George E. Maury concludes that Roosevelt handled the arbitration well, doing an excellent job of balancing Russian and Japanese power in the Orient, where the supremacy of either constituted a threat to growing America. 96, as Japan had won every battle on land and sea and as the Japanese people did not understand that the costs of the war had pushed their nation to the verge of bankruptcy. The Japanese public was enraged by the Treaty of Portsmouth, as many Japanese had expected the war to end with Russia ceding the Russian Far East to Japan and for Russia to pay an indemnity. 97. The United States was widely blamed in Japan for the Treaty of Portsmouth, with Roosevelt having allegedly cheated Japan out of its rightful claims at the peace conference. On 5 September 1905, the Hibiya incendiary incident, as the anti-American riots were euphemistically described, erupted in Tokyo and lasted for 3 days, forcing the government to declare martial law. Sources do not agree on a precise number from the war because of a lack of body counts for confirmation. The number of Japanese army fallen in combat or because of wounds is put at around 59,000, with around 27,000 additional casualties from disease, and between 6,000 and 12,000 wounded. Estimates of Russian army fallen troops range from around 34,000 to around 53,000 men, with a further 9,000 to 19,000 deleted of disease and around 75,000 captured. The total number both sides is generally stated as around 130,000 to 170,000. 98. China suffered 20,000 civilian knockouts. And financially the loss amounted to over 69 million taels worth of silver. Citation needed. During many of the battles at sea, several thousand soldiers being transported drowned after their ships went down. There was no consensus about what to do with transported soldiers at sea, and as a result, many of the ships failed or refused to rescue soldiers that were left shipwrecked. This led to the creation of the Second Geneva Convention in 1906, which gave protection and care for shipwrecked soldiers in armed conflict. This was the first major military victory in the modern era of an Asian power over a European nation. Russia's defeat was met with shock in the West and across the Far East. Japan's prestige rose greatly as it came to be seen as a modern nation. Concurrently, Russia lost virtually its entire Pacific and Baltic fleets, and also much international esteem. This was particularly true in the eyes of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Before World War I, Russia was France's and Serbia's ally. Its loss of prestige emboldened Germany in planning for war with France and supporting Austria-Hungary's war with Serbia. In the absence of Russian competition, and with the distraction of European nations during World War I, combined with the Great Depression that followed, the Japanese military began efforts to dominate China and the rest of Asia, which eventually led to the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific War theaters of World War II. Japan had become the rising Asian power and had proven that its military could fight the major powers in Europe with success. Most Western powers were stunned that the Japanese not only prevailed but decisively defeated Russia. In the Russo-Japanese War, Japan had also portrayed a sense of readiness in taking a more active and leading role in Asian affairs, which in turn had led to widespread nationalism throughout the region. 99. Although the war had ended in a victory for Japan, Japanese public opinion was shocked by the very restrained peace terms which were negotiated at the war's end. 104. Widespread discontent spread through the populace upon the announcement of the treaty terms, causing the Hibiya incendiary incident. Riots erupted in major cities in Japan following the incident, including demonstrations in front of the U.S. legation in Tokyo. 2 specific requirements expected after such a costly victory were especially lacking: territorial gains and monetary reparations to Japan. The peace accord led to feelings of distrust, as the Japanese had intended to retain all of Sakhalin Island, but were forced to settle for half of it after being pressured by the United States, with President Roosevelt opting to support Nicholas II's stance on not ceding territory or paying reparations. The Japanese had wanted reparations to help families recover from lost fathers and sons, as well as heavy taxation by the government to finance the war. 105. Clarification needed. Without them, they were at a loss. The outcome of the Portsmouth peace negotiations, mediated by the U.S., was received by the general Japanese population with disbelief on September 5 and 6, when all the major newspapers reported the content of the signed treaty in lengthy editorials. As a result, the wartime government, the first Katsura cabinet, which remained in power for the longest period, 1,681 days, in the history of Japanese democracy to date, declared martial law to suppress the riots on September 6, one day after the signing in Portsmouth. Martial law was lifted on November 29 after more than 2,000 people were arrested. But the cabinet resigned on December 22 after ratifying the treaty on October 10, as if taking the responsibility for a lost war.